Hello, everyone. This is Sharon Terry with Genetic Alliance. We are delighted today to bring you a webinar on the IOM clinical trial data sharing report. This is the culmination of a year-long process or so in an IOM study on sharing clinical trial data, which we've subtitled Maximizing Benefits and Minimizing Risks. Today's presenters will include Bernie Lowe, who was the committee chair. He's president of the Greenwall Foundation. We'll also have with us to make comments and then also to answer questions, Devin McGraw, who is a committee member and is a partner at Manette, Phelps & Phillips, and Tim Coates, who is a chief research officer at the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And before I turn it over to Bernie, which I'll do now momentarily here, I just want to say that I also served as a member of this committee. Having served on quite a number of IOM studies, I want to say that this was probably in some ways, one of the most difficult committees in the sense that we had a great deal of work to do. We were ably led by Bernie, and our kind of teammates or our committee mates were really terrific to work with. So this was really an inspiring opportunity, I think, to make a difference in the world that all of us who are present today on the webinar care about. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Bernie.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And our thanks to you and Genetic Alliance for putting together this webinar. It's really important for us as a committee to have this report and its recommendations reach the people who ultimately have the most benefit, patients and their families. On the first slide, whoops, I'm having trouble advancing this. There you go. I just wanted to say a little bit about the study context, and just to start by emphasizing that responsible sharing of clinical trial data is in the public interest. Currently, much of the data collected in clinical trials, which is really the result of the contributions of volunteers in clinical trials, it's not analyzed and published in a timely manner. It's important in order to advance science that's really the foundation of good clinical care to use these data from clinical trials and to disseminate the findings widely. The sharing of clinical trial data also allows other investigators to try to reproduce the published findings from trials. It does, we think, maximize the contributions of participants, and it maximizes the effort and the funds invested in trials by trial sponsors and the scientists. Around the world, there's momentum for data sharing, and we think that the question now, the public policy issue, is not whether to share clinical trial data, but rather what types of clinical trial data should be shared, when they should be shared, and how they should be shared to maximize the benefits of sharing and minimize the risks. So what I'm going to do is briefly go over the context and background, talk about our conceptual framework, and really focus on our recommendations. And we'll try and leave a lot of time for you in the audience to ask questions, and I'm going to turn those over to Devin and Tim. As background, the trial was sponsored by a group of 23 public and private sponsors. The IOM put together a committee with diverse expertise and experience, and it attempted to have a balanced committee with different perspectives represented. The report did go through a rigorous IOM peer review process before it was approved and published. Our charge was to describe the types of data that might be shared from clinical trials, when they are shared, and with whether the sharing is with or without restrictions. We also were charged with identifying the benefits, risks, and challenges of sharing clinical trial data for different stakeholders, and it was important for us to look at the perspectives of the various stakeholders in the clinical trials enterprise. Finally, we were asked to make recommendations to enhance responsible sharing of clinical trial data. want to spend a minute on key definitions and call your attention to the second bullet with this color coding. A lot of times when people talk about data sharing, they mean different things. And we, in the report, thought it was important to distinguish different types of things that might be shared. And first I want to say that there's a lot of discussion, a lot of movement towards sharing the results of clinical trials. So, for example, making scientific publications accessible to the public. That's sharing the results. Our report really was talking about sharing of the data that underlie the results. Summary data are data that are tables, figures, charts that don't include individual participant data. And that can be very useful for replicating results and also for carrying out additional analyses. But for some studies, for some additional research, you really need to have access to individual participant data. For example, if you want to combine different clinical trials to do a meta-analysis. And we'll talk about the protections that need to be put in place when you're sharing individual participant level data, even if it's de-identified. And finally, when we say data, we also mean metadata, data about the data that describes what each element in the data field means. And also, we want to have sharing of the protocol, the statistical analysis plan, and actually even the analytic code that was used to analyze the data. So we identified a number of benefits of clinical trial data sharing. Other investigators who are not affiliated with the study can reproduce the published findings and carry out additional analyses. This will strengthen the evidence base for regulatory decisions by the FDA and also clinical decisions by patients and their physicians. Data sharing can lead to new ideas for additional research. As we already mentioned, it increases the contributions of participants, and it can protect participants by avoiding future studies that are unnecessarily duplicative. And finally, it just increases the scientific knowledge gained from the work of trialists and investments by funders. And ultimately, this knowledge will lead to better treatments and better care. We articulated guiding principles for data sharing. First, that it's important to maximize the benefits of sharing data while minimizing the risks of such sharing. We need to respect the individual participants whose data are shared and without whom trials would be impossible. We need to increase public trust in clinical trials and in the sharing of trial data. And finally, we need to conduct data sharing, carry it out in a way that's fair to all the participants, to all the stakeholders. Now, there are multiple stakeholder interests that need to be acknowledged and balanced. First, we need to protect participants and maximize their contributions. Clinical trialists, the people who spend really it's years designing, organizing, carrying out the trial, need a fair opportunity to publish their analyses and to get academic credit for their considerable work in designing a trial, but also for sharing the data. On the other hand, other investigators, not part of the trial, have an interest in having access to the data to analyze it and to reproduce findings, carry out additional investigations. As a society, as a public, we want to reduce the risk of invalid secondary analyses. We don't want people using the data to come up with conclusions that aren't scientifically valid. We also want to protect the intellectual property and legitimate commercially confidential information of the trial sponsors. Without those protections, the incentives for developing additional new products and carrying out additional trials in the future would be decreased. The committee articulated a vision for data sharing. What would we like to see in the future? And we really would called for data sharing that advances the science that really is the foundation of good medical care. We called for a culture of sharing data where it's just expected of clinical trialists and sponsors with effective incentives to share and protections for those who share. There need to be multiple interoperable platforms, places to which clinical trialists and sponsors can upload their data for sharing. There will be different models of data sharing. People will do it in somewhat different ways, and there need to be platforms that allow data to be shared in different ways. Those platforms need to be interoperable in the sense that data from one platform, one trial, needs to be able to be compared with and possibly combined with data from other trials on other platforms. There should be best practices for how to share clinical trial data. These should be identified, and they should be modified as time goes on in response to evidence about what works in data sharing and what doesn't work. And finally, we call for a sustainable, equitable funding model to fund the sharing of clinical trial data. For it to really continue into the future, we need to put it on a firm economic or business footing. I'm now going to turn to the recommendations. We had 4 overarching recommendations with a lot of sort of sub-recommendations under each. First recommendation was on stakeholder responsibilities. We called for every stakeholder in clinical trials to take specific actions that would foster a culture in which data sharing is expected. It's the norm. In the next slide, I sort of list in bullet form what different stakeholders should do. Funders and sponsors should require clinical trial data sharing as part of their contractual or grants agreement. And they also should provide appropriate support for sharing the data. We don't want this to be an unfunded mandate. Investigators should share data in accordance with the recommendations we make elsewhere. Medical journals can play a key role in requiring that authors who publish results from a trial in their journal share the analytic data set that supports the publication. So the data on which the results, the findings and tables are based need to be shared with others who can then try to verify and replicate the results. Universities and research institutions should require data sharing and use it as a criterion in promotion. Disease advocacy organizations, of which many of you on the webinar I think are active and leaders, should have a key role to play in educating participants about clinical trial data sharing, its benefits, its risks, why it's important, and consider the sharing of data, plans to share the data when you review trials to either support them financially or to recommend them to your constituents. We also have a recommendation for regulatory agencies. I'll skip that. But also we think that institutional review boards have a role to play, that they should consider data sharing when they review clinical trials. We actually think it increases the benefit of participating in a clinical trial that the data will be shared, and it it reduces the benefit of the trial if the investigators aren't planning to share the data. IRBs should provide guidance and actual templates for the informed consent process and forms, and IRBs should adopt the protections that we recommend in our report for participants when data are shared. Our second recommendation addresses what types of clinical trial data should be shared and when in the life cycle of a clinical trial should the data be shared. And the recommendations on the following slides are no later than. We call on sponsors and investigators to share various types of data no later than specific times we give. So the next slide provides an overview of the milestones in a clinical trial. And then we tied sharing of different types of data to different milestones. So first milestone is trial design and registration. Even before the next milestone, which is the beginning of participant enrollment. Later on, the data are collected and the study is completed or terminated. Sometime later, the investigators analyze the data and publish the results. And there may also be the data from the trial may also be submitted to regulatory authorities as part of a approval process for a new drug or new indication, and there's a branch point of whether the trial, a specific trial, will be submitted or not for regulatory approval. So for the first milestone, the completion of the trial design phase and the beginning of registration, we call for certain information data to be shared. Already, before a clinical trial enrolls patients, certain registration elements need to be put up on a public website like clinicaltrials.gov. We call for also putting up on a publicly accessible website the plan the trial has for data sharing, so that before the trial begins, the investigator and sponsor say what the data sharing plan will be. Later on, when the trial is completed or terminated, we say that no later than 12 months after completion, certain data should be shared. First, a lay language summary of the results should be shared with clinical trial participants. We heard, partly as a result of the webinar that Genetic Alliance held after our interim report, that many participants in trials complained that they participated and they really didn't find out what the trial found, what the results were. And we think that's something can be corrected by the writing and dissemination of a lay summary. Already there is a requirement, which is being expanded, for summary level results to be put up on a website like clinicaltrials.gov, and we also supported that practice. The next milestone is publication of an article giving the results of a trial. And just a sentence to say that publication results in a peer-reviewed journal is the accepted way of disseminating results while also submitting them to peer review so that others can evaluate whether they agree or not with the published results. We called for sharing of certain data no later than 6 months after publication. And what the data we called for to be shared at that time are the data that support the findings, tables, and figures in the publication. The idea is someone not affiliated with the trial should be able to get the data that the trialists used to reach their published findings and check, verify, carry out alternative analyses, and possibly to carry out additional analyses. In addition to that, of course, the protocol, analysis plan, and code. I won't keep repeating it. We said no later than 6 months after publication, and this is somewhat controversial point. There are people who call for data sharing much sooner after publication, perhaps simultaneously with publication. And on the other hand, others who are concerned that if you have the sharing of the analyzable data set, the analytic data set supporting the publication too soon, it doesn't give the investigators time to start to do and to publish additional analyses. We chose 6 months as a compromise, but we think as a culture of clinical trial data sharing strengthens and people actually change how trials are carried out and analyzed with data sharing in mind, we eventually called for sharing of the analytic data set at the time of publication. Moving ahead, what additional data should be shared later on? And that answer depended on whether the trial would be part of a package for regulatory approval or not. If not, we said no later than 18 months after study completion, the full analyzable data set plus the usual supporting information. If the data are submitted to a regulatory application, we wanted to give a quiet period for the regulatory agencies to consider not just the trial, but all of the other data that they have in hand about the product and the indication. We said that 30 days after regulatory approval, the full analyzable data set, including redacted clinical study reports, should be shared, or 18 months after the indication for which approval is being sought is abandoned by the sponsor and not turned over to another company. So the second recommendation had to do with what data and when. The third recommendation had to do with whom are data shared and under what conditions, how are they shared. We recommended that the holders of clinical trial data who would have the authority to share the data should take the following steps. First, to employ data use agreements with those who gain access to or given access to the data. This can reduce the risks, enhance the scientific value of secondary analyses, and protect public health. We recommended that an independent review panel that's independent of the sponsor or funder, and that panel should also include members of the public, should review the data requests from other investigators and decide access. We think sponsors, funders should make public their data sharing policies and procedures, and furthermore, learn from experience by prospectively collecting data on the outcomes of sharing information and the lessons learned with a view towards improving the data sharing process. This is still relatively early days in data sharing, and we want to make this data sharing process as effective and respectful of patients, participants as possible. Our fourth recommendation really looked to the future, that we realized that there are a lot of very specific and sometimes very thorny issues that our panel was not in a position to work out, and actually no one can work out at this time. It has to be worked out in the future, really among the people who are involved in data sharing from various perspectives. So we said stakeholders need to work together on key challenges to try and achieve the vision of data sharing that we articulated. And we identified a number of those challenges. They're infrastructure challenges. There are not enough platforms at this point. Technological challenges. The current data sharing platforms are not readily discoverable, searchable, and interoperable. There are workforce challenges, and most important, there are sustainability challenges. Currently, a small subset of sponsors, funders, and clinical trialists are supporting the cost of clinical trial data sharing. They cannot continue to do so by themselves. Our report calls for those who benefit from clinical trial data sharing, including secondary users, should pay a fair share of the costs. And working out what the costs are and what's an equitable sharing distribution of the costs is a challenge that needs to be worked out. To try to implement these further steps, we called on people, including the sponsors of the trial, and trusted impartial organizations to convene a multi-stakeholder body with global reach and broad representation. And by that, we really want to have patient representatives and advocates, disease advocates, to be part of this discussion, to be a major voice in the discussion, so that these challenges can be addressed. So the next couple of slides, and as Sharon said, these will be up on the website soon. List of members, study sponsors, and the full text of the report can be downloaded on this Institute of Medicine website. And I also want to thank the Institute of Medicine staff. India Hook Barnard was the study director, and Ann Claiborne was the senior program officer, who were really indispensable to this work, as well as the others listed on the slide. So with that, I thank you, and I'm going to turn it back to Sharon to continue with the rest of the program and to lead up to an opportunity for questions. Thanks very much.
So now I'm going to ask first Devin and then Tim to comment anything that you want to pull out or comment on before we turn to the questions. And I'll remind the participants that you may type your question into the question box, which is in the control panel, at any time during this, and we'll collate the questions as we go.
Okay. Sharon, thank you very much. You know, in looking, we don't have any questions yet, so I'll take this opportunity to sort of emphasize some of the recommendations that we have in the report that are aimed at protecting the privacy of the information, the clinical trial data that's shared. Ultimately, you know, the risks of something happening in terms of a privacy issue. Most often, those are characterized as, you know, re-identifications of data or reuse of that information in a way that was not, you know, potentially foreseen by the data subject when they agreed to participate in the study, or that the data subject would be concerned about. We really grappled with those issues pretty significantly during the study period, and ultimately that's why we landed on a model for sharing data that has some controls associated with it. You know, certainly de-identification of the data is an important strategy for protecting privacy. We had a paper written by 2 experts on de-identification about how one can go about maximizing protections against re-identification risk in a data set, but you can't reduce those risks to 0. And so subsequently we call for some controls over access, and specifically a data use agreement that at a minimum can place some constraints around what the data can be used for, and also include commitments not to re-identify the data. Those are not foolproof. They are sort of dependent on people's willingness to abide by them. But notwithstanding that they're not perfect vehicles, they certainly will be helpful in putting some controls around how people use these data, so that we don't increase privacy risks by sharing it. And we also thought that they would have an important normative impact, where people would, you know, really be required to commit to not doing harm with the data as part of a condition of being able to access it.
Great, thank you, Devin. And Tim, comments?
So I'm going to, I guess, comment from the standpoint of someone representing a patient advocacy organization. You know, first of all, it was an honor to be on this group with Sharon. I learned a lot, and I think, you know, the takeaway I have from the report is that I think the recommendations and the vision that was articulated by our committee, I think really was, I think, an important effort to what I see described as honoring the participation of clinical trial participants in these studies, where, you know, many individuals engage in this for very important personal and scientific reasons. And I think that, you know, we're articulating that in this equation of clinical trials, it's not just the investigators, but the investigators plus sponsors plus the participants all have something to share in this, and that we need to honor the participation of the trial participants in this, and really make sure that the data that they help contribute is available to as many people as possible. I also think we aim to really balance the kind of culture change that is required to get full open participation with clinical trial data, and that there are many contours to this debate. And as Bernie noted, there are those who call for immediate open, put everything out there, and others who are more who would prefer an even more staggered approach than the one we recommended. And you know, I think we really aim for a real middle ground that acknowledges all of the different players and all of the different perspectives to, again, come back to a place where we can say that we truly are honoring the participation of individuals in many of these clinical trials and really maximizing their contribution as much as we can. I think that's about all. I don't have much to add to what Bernie and Devin presented. So Sharon, back to you.
So what problems do you predict with sharing and storing non-U.S. individuals' data, participant data, given that now we're living in a global economy?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, Devin, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give it a start. I mean, we from the very beginning had as part of our charge that we needed to look at the data sharing environment in a global way. And that, you know, included taking a look, for example, at the laws that exist in different countries about how data can be shared and when consent is or isn't required, and what are the standards for considering when data are de-identified. And they vary quite a bit across the jurisdictions. You know, ultimately, you know, we didn't at any point in the report call for, you know, one single database or system for sharing clinical trial data. And we recognized all along that what's happening already today, which is the seeding and the implementation of a number of different data sharing initiatives, was likely going to be the way to sort of build an entire ecosystem of data sharing, not trying to create a one-size-fits-all mechanism, but to try to create many opportunities for data sharing. Although, as Bernie pointed out in his presentation, that there, you know, will ultimately be a need for some consistency in terms of interoperability of the data standards, et cetera. But you know, given that there's a lot of differences in how legal regimes across the globe handle this, there is going to be a need for some tailoring of solutions, but that also brings opportunities for lessons learned, and hence the last recommendation that we make, that that our study really we consider to be sort of the first step in what we hope will be a long learning journey that will take place internationally on what's the best way to do this, what's the best way to share this data.
Great, thanks very much. So could you talk about whether there's any way to prevent the misuse of data, and whether or not, for example, we may need legislation to make a law to enforce good use and prevent the misuse of data?
I I can also take that one, but I'm also happy for Tim or Bernie to take it.
Tim, do you want to start? And then Devin, I know have some things to say as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really thought that through. We thought through the issue of the potential for misuse, whether it's through re-identification or using the data even if you don't re-identify it in an irresponsible way. But and hence our recommendations around, creating some controlled environments to enable data sharing, protections against re-identification that would come through data use agreements. We did at some point in our deliberations consider whether legislation would be at all helpful, and I think ultimately because we intended our study to have a global reach, we tried to pick a vehicle that we thought was more feasible from a global perspective, but that doesn't sort of preclude stakeholders from thinking through on a going forward basis what might be the best way to assure protections for data in their particular data sharing initiatives that exist in their country or in their region of the world. And then for some sharing of knowledge about how well that works. Sometimes I can, speaking from a U.S. perspective, while legislation can sometimes seem like it's the best vehicle for doing so, it's often really hard to define what would be a prohibited use, for example, and defining it in a way that doesn't preclude beneficial uses. Even something that seems as simple as prohibiting re-identification probably needs to be thought through to allow for re-identification when it's needed to alert people to things that are discovered in the data that they should know about, or to allow security professionals to test the robustness of the identification. They often do that through what are called white hat attacks on security systems. So, and de-identification algorithms. So it may sound simple, but it's not. But it is something that would be great to see some further discussion through shared experiences of data sharing initiatives.
And Bernie, did you want to comment further on that?
I'm going to defer to Tim. I said a lot already. Tim, do you have
Okay, Tim.
anything to say?
It's hard to follow Devin on a question like that one. I think the point to emphasize, and I think this is something that we work through as a committee, and I think it's just going to be part of the environment in which we're working, is that at some level we do need to try things, we need to create systems, and I think at one point we described have a learning ecosystem around this, because I think for us to say today this is what we should do, shouldn't do, does not, I think, allow for what will be inevitable adaptation as both how clinical trials are conducted and how regulatory frameworks may evolve over time. And that to try to be too prescriptive at this point would, it's easy to do. It would be not easy, but you could do it. But I think my sense of it was that would just set up something that would then have to be changed again in the future. And I think I would say we weren't quite at that place just yet.
Yeah.
And Devin, just to follow that up, so to be precise, what U.S. laws currently apply to data protection, and I know that we could get into state laws, et cetera, but even just on the federal level, specifically clinical data and including observational data, I know that's a really complicated question, but can you make an overarching quick statement?
Oh, sure. No, so HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, privacy and security and enforcement regulations are going to apply when the clinical trial data is held by an entity that's covered by those laws. So an academic medical center, for example, a hospital, a physician practice, a pharmacy, a lab, and any contractors to those entities. So HIPAA doesn't cover all clinical trial data, but certainly when it's gathered and held by entities that are covered by HIPAA is going to apply to them. And similarly, the common rule, which is the human subjects regulations that apply at a federal level when you're doing research that is either federally supported or being done in an institution that is that is agreed by contract with the government to abide by those federal laws, even for research that's not federally supported. Those put some parameters around how clinical trial data can be accessed and shared for research purposes, and sometimes state laws may apply in certain circumstances as well. And whether those state laws apply or not is going to depend on sort of whether the state has jurisdiction over the entity that is collecting and sharing the data. So it's not a single regime. On top of that, if you're sort of out of scope of all of those laws, but you're a for-profit entity, the Federal Trade Commission has some authority to oversee practices with personal data under their Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Authority, which generally they exercise when they think that a company is using data in ways that are not consistent with commitments that have been made to consumers, such as through a privacy policy or a consent form.
Great, thanks. So what is the recommendation for giving research participants the ability to choose which future research their data would be used for? So this is from the participant perspective. What was the recommendation?
Tim, do you want to go ahead on this one?
Was that me, Bernie?
Yeah, please.
I think, and I'll ask my colleagues to correct me if I get it wrong. I don't know that our specific recommendation, it put that power specifically in the hands of the participants. I think that, we I think recognize that is, one of the areas that I think many participants do want to, have some measure of control over. But I think that, the infrastructure that we put in place, it may not be feasible to go back to individuals and to say, to have them put specific data. I guess put ring-fence data from specific studies. I think that would then, undermine the ability for the data to be used in the most impactful way. But I think that is an area that we probably, as we learn through the implementation of this, if one sees that many participants do indeed want to put fences around the use of their data, then that will, for secondary studies, that I think would be a consideration for, how we might have to adapt and evolve the system. It's an important question because I think, individuals, want a certain level of autonomy, I think, in terms of how their data gets used.
Yeah, I would only add to Tim's answer that there is a pretty, I wouldn't call it lengthy, but a good discussion of the issues around informed consent and the desire to, at a minimum, let participants in clinical trials know from the outset when they're enrolled in the trial that the data will be shared, and to try to provide some details around how that data will be shared, even if you can't necessarily foresee all of the studies for which that data may be used. We acknowledged that providing people with some more granular options other than, all in or even all out was potentially desirable in terms of an autonomy standpoint and worth pursuing, or looking at how implementation of granular options, what the impact of that is on the sharing of clinical trial data, as well as the enhancement of trust by participants in clinical trial data sharing. But we also acknowledge that, if the subsequent sharing is on a database that is incomplete because people, some of the original participants are not in the database, that could be potentially problematic for the science that results, and that that it's not always easy to foresee at the front end what types of data sharing will be involved in the future. We also recognize that for clinical trial data sets that already exist, the consent forms for the individuals in that trial may not have presumed clinical trial data sharing, and that there would need to be an examination of those forms in order to look at a pre-existing data sets in terms of being able to share them in the future. I think it's also the reason why the recommendation for sharing includes some independent decision making about when clinical trial data sharing are released, and the desire to have representatives of participants in the review effort.
Great, thanks very much. So did the report recommend any standard data agreements that could be circulated?
Yeah. Those would be great. We did not dive into the level of detail of evaluating data sharing agreements and recommending any particular models, but certainly they exist out there. We had lots of testimony from initiatives that use them, and I think that's an excellent suggestion for part of the evolving learning community around clinical trial data sharing.
Great. How about whether or not the recommendations pertain to new clinical trials? What about trials that have already been completed but did not include on the consent form plans to share individual level data? So if a trial has ended, what's the recommendation there?
So we recognize that this would be the case, and in fact we had some testimony from, I think this was from Bartha Knoppers, who has done a lot of review of informed consent forms, particularly for genetic research, and she, told us that a number of the consent forms that she has seen and evaluated do not expressly provide for clinical trial data sharing. And this is one of those circumstances where ethical, review of those consent forms and discussion about whether you can go forward in a responsible way with clinical trial data sharing is really going to be a case-by-case endeavor. Some consent forms may say, we absolutely will not share your data at all except for this trial, and that's a fairly rigorous prohibition that might be difficult to get out from to figure out a way to resolve that. On the other hand, the data sharing that we're contemplating is sharing of de-identified data in a controlled way. So can a ethical institutional review board or research ethics board become comfortable with sharing that data under certain conditions, and maybe with some additional transparency to data subjects, or an effort to try to recontact them depending on the circumstances. So that it is definitely one where there's no one-size-fits-all answer, but a recognition that that those may be difficult cases and worthy of a pretty comprehensive discussion in terms of determining whether or not you can move forward with clinical trial data sharing and under what circumstances.
And there's a nuance that's been added to that question, and maybe Bernie, you could comment on this. So the question asked, how about handling trial data that has ended but still have ongoing follow-up vis-a-vis gathering observational data?
Right, and I think that question shows the complexity of clinical trials, the variation of clinical trials, and how so much of this is going to ultimately come down to a case-by-case assessment based on the guiding principles that we try to articulate. I think eventually we want to see the data from a clinical trial shared in a responsible way. Having said that, the data that are collected earlier that go towards the analyses of the main results and are published will be shared sooner than data that's collected even after the trial ends in terms of the primary endpoints. It's important for the follow-on data to give the investigators in the clinical trial some opportunity to have first chance to analyze the data they collected and to publish it. We thought it would be a severe disincentive to carry out a clinical trial if others could gain access to the data before you had, as a trialist, a fair chance to analyze the data. Having said that, you don't want to have clinical trials in the position of holding on to data for years, not really publishing in a timely manner, in some cases not publishing at all. So that's why we pegged the release of different data at different time points, and I think the observational data that are collected after the formal conclusion of the trial, that's going to not be shared in as prompt a fashion as the data that support the published results or the major primary and secondary endpoints of the trial. And I should just say, increasingly, as we're able to combine clinical trial data with other data from, say, medical records, electronic health records, doing so obviously in a way that protects confidentiality, you're going to see more of these databases that take the clinical trial database and add to it from data from other sources. And they're both opportunities to gain more knowledge, but also the richer the additional data that are combined, the more the risk for re-identification that needs to be protected against.
Great, thanks very much. Has the FDA expressed an opinion on the committee's recommendation or data sharing in general? It's always dangerous to say what the FDA thinks,
yeah,
but...
no, I think we had a good briefing with them. They were one of the study sponsors, but I think we should leave to them their expression of opinion about the study.
Yeah. Maybe we should say they do have out for public comment a proposal to share data that's masked so that the individual drug which the trial was testing isn't revealed. And our recommendations go far beyond that. But our recommendations really don't hinge on the FDA announcing a new policy or Congress passing additional legislation. The recommendations we made can all be adopted by the major stakeholders in clinical trials, particularly the funders, sponsors, investigators, and research institutions.
Okay, we're coming down to the end of our questions, so if anybody has any more, we just have a couple more we're going to field here. We are coming also down to the end of our time. Bernie, I'm not sure you want to take this, or if we want to see if either Ann or India, who are also able to unmute, want to take it, but will there be any follow-up from IOM on this issue, and is there specific follow-up assigned to these stakeholder groups?
Well, let me say that I'll leave to India and Ann the question about the IOM, but I think that we do call on specific groups to take steps to implement these reports, the recommendations. So we call on funders and sponsors to require clinical trial data sharing as we recommend. We call on journals to require it of authors who publish. We call on others to sort of move ahead with the challenges that still need to be addressed. And I think we also, as I said, call on patient advocacy groups and disease organizations to take the lead in proactively helping the public and patients and potential trial participants understand the benefits, risks, and challenges of data sharing, and to sort of push on clinical trial sponsors and investigators to include robust data sharing plans in their study designs.
Great, thanks. Tim, do you want to add anything since, you know, these webinars are often listened to by, it's one of the webinar sets or series that will be having the most of the disease advocacy organizations listening. Do you want to add anything for disease advocacy organizations to flesh out a little of what Bernie said?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the, so, you know, as someone who represents a disease advocacy organization, one of the next steps we're taking is to actually take these recommendations and, you know, as we fund clinical trials, actually begin to implement and allocate resources to both evaluate trials on whether or not they have a data sharing plan, but also, you know, provide resources to create the data sharing plan. And even, you know, I think as you and I and others probably will talk more about, Sharon, is how the disease advocacy community can come together to actually begin to lead the way around this, and not just necessarily wait for our government agencies to be the ones that, you know, implement, you know, the policies. You know, I think that disease advocacy organizations, we have a responsibility in this as well, and that you know, this is part of the work that I'll be doing with my team at the National Met Society, but also I think anticipate that there'll be opportunities for patient advocacy community together to come and, you know, perhaps pioneer some of this, the implementation of the culture that we're trying to, the culture change that we're trying to manifest through this report.
Great, thanks very much. So a couple of other questions are just housekeeping ones. So before I get to those, I just, sorry, Anne, could you, I see that you're able to unmute. If you could say something about what the IOM plans to do going forward.
Sure, thanks. The IOM has a number of roundtables that serve as discussion formats to convene stakeholders to talk about these kinds of health sciences policy issues. And there were several roundtables at the IOM that address issues in drug discovery and development, genomics research, neuroscience, and cancer that really served as sort of foundational activities and discussion forums to give rise to the study a few years ago to begin with. So those roundtables could certainly, and we hope that they will, serve as a forum to convene stakeholders, to discuss possible next steps for the future. We would certainly welcome the opportunity to work with other organizations to do that as well. So we're in a stage where we're happy to help, and certainly looking forward to the discussions about how, if at all, the IOM could offer a space to convene those kinds of discussions, because as the presenters have mentioned, there's a lot more work to be done.
Terrific. And I'll take this moment actually to thank Anne and India, who are some of the IOM staff that we worked with, who did a tremendous amount of heavy lifting. You can imagine trying to study this issue over a year with a lot of data that we ourselves, our kind of data that we had to go through. So I want to thank Bernie and Tim and Devin for wonderful presentations and great fielding of the questions. I want to remind everybody that the webinar recording and the slides are available within 1 week on our archive site. And I want to also point you to that site anyway, because we have there a large number of webinars archived. And those webinars include a whole series we've been doing on data, big data, little data, what it means to maximize our benefits from data sharing, measuring the mass of all measures, it's called. And we have a few more webinars in that series that will be coming up this year, for example, BD2K, which is Big Data to Knowledge. Again, thanks very much to Bernie, to Devin, and to Tim, and have a good day, everyone.